So hello and welcome to our webinar on EU cybersecurity legislation. Thank you for joining us today. The cybersecurity landscape in Europe is evolving rapidly, and 2025 is going to be the year for new laws and increased compliance expectations across all sectors. So what we will do in the webinar today is exploring some of these new legal changes, legal developments, and regulatory expectations. And as part of that discussion, we will include some discussion about the updated NIS2 Directive and the NIS Implementation Regulation, the Cyber Resilience Act, and the Digital Operation Resilience Act. These measures, they aim to harmonize standards, strengthen resilience, and foster trust in the digital economy. But they also introduce new obligations for businesses across Europe. So now, before we really start this webinar, there is some important housekeeping notes that I need to share with you. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording can be found on our Digital Transformation Academy website. On this website, you can also find webinars and videos of other relevant digitization topics. If you have questions during this webinar, please feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A, but you can also reach out to us at any time after this webinar. And then can we go to the next slide, please? With us, I mean my amazing colleagues that join me for this webinar today. And these colleagues are Louise Crawford. She's a partner in our London office, and she works with many of our clients on their DORA compliance strategies. But also here today is Henrik Hansen. He is a counsel in our Hamburg office, and Henrik works very closely together with a lot of clients on their Cyber Resilience Act compliance strategies. So what we do as a global team, we bring all the expertise together to really help our clients benefit from the global network, but also to benchmark what they do versus what other clients are doing. We do that in interactions with regulators, but foremost important to us is making sure that we build compliance strategies or commercial strategies that work well for our clients, looking at what is the legal expectation, but also what is realistic for the businesses to achieve. So here's the agenda for today. We will start off with some introduction words about the current cybersecurity state of play. Then we'll dive into the NIS2 compliance requirements, the Cyber Resilience Act, the Digital Operations Resilience Act, and then at the end, we'll have some minutes for questions. But now let's start. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here is the cyber threat landscape that we see in 2025. I think everybody has seen the news, the greater exposure of cybersecurity risks, the threats that arise, but also the expectations that are set by regulators and businesses globally. Those expectations come from the new legislations, but they also come from basically the expectations that companies take better care of what they do, that they provide cyber resilient products to the markets, but also have a very good understanding of what they do internally, where they have to protect their data or their products. And we see a lot of technology that has a dual role now. For instance, AI. AI is being used as a threat actor as well as a defensive product. And we see opportunities on both sides. And that is important to consider because it requires us to consider that from also the legal perspective. If we look at the amount of threats, we see an increase in threats throughout the world, but we also see an increased amount of damages that apply to these threats. And all in all, that leads to greater vulnerability and better opportunities for our clients to position themselves in a way that they really act as being cyber resilient. Can we go to the next slide, please? Henrik, do you want to take this one?
Yes. So what you've described, Joke, is exactly reflected in the ENISA report of the last year on the state of the cybersecurity in the European Union. And we see a picture that we also see in our daily practice that we have an increasing amount of cyber threats and cyber attacks with a large portion of ransomware attacks, which I think most of our participants of this webinar will also be familiar with, leading to a massive amount of damages for the entire industry. There's a forecast mentioned in the report of total damages estimated for 2025 of 10.5 trillion US dollars, which really reflects the substantial risks from cyber security threats. At the same time, we do not only have increased risk, but we also see that organizations report a certain cyber skill gap with their staff and employees, which is actually increasing. And according to a survey of the World Economic Forum, actually only 14% of organizations are confident that they have the skills and resources to sufficiently tackle cybersecurity risks. This situation is somehow also reflected in the European cybersecurity legislation landscape. So we have on a very high level, we have on a sector-specific regulation, we have the NIS2 Directive and the CER Directive, which apply more or less to operators of critical infrastructures. And then we have on a product level, the Cyber Resilience Act that we will cover today as well. And we have as a sector-specific regulation for the financial sector, DORA. In addition, the European legislator has implemented the Cybersecurity Act, which strengthens the position of the ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Authority, and introduces the cybersecurity certification framework. So with this quick overview, we can jump right into the NIS2 compliance.
Well, let me take that one. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the NIS2 Directive, I suppose many of you have a good understanding of what the NIS2 Directive is about. But for those who don't, so the NIS2 Directive expands the scope of EU cybersecurity laws, bringing more sectors and entities, including medium and large organizations in critical and important industries, in scope of a directive that requires companies to really consider cyber resilience from the outset. There is a requirement for stricter risk management, stricter reporting obligations, but also, for instance, for supply chain security organizations. What we see with NIS2, and we're also going to discuss that slide in relation to DORA, is that there is also separate accountability rules applicable to senior management within organizations. There are explicit requirements for oversight, for training, and for liability in terms of non-compliance. And national authorities have enhanced enforcement powers, including the ability to impose substantial fines. So if we look at the NIS2 Directive now, it is a directive, which basically means that there is a requirement to transpose this into national law. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is where it becomes a bit tricky. So what we see in practice is that organizations were required to have this implemented and in effect, but also member states were required to have this implemented into to their national laws. But most member states didn't meet the deadline. So what we see is that there's only a few countries, those are the countries listed in green, that actually worked on national transposition of the NIS2 Directive. Many of the member states are yet to do this. So as a result of that, or maybe to give some further pressure, can we go to the next slide, please? We are now in a situation that we not only have a NIS2 Directive, but we also have an implementing regulation. The benefit of the implementing regulation is that it sets immediate standards that are directly applicable to companies without the necessity to transpose that into member state law. And this is an important consideration to have. But in addition to that, it is also important to consider that for companies that are maybe established in member states that haven't yet implemented the NIS2 Directive into national law, we see in practice that regulators expect compliance with these requirements anyway. That the way they ask the questions sets the expectation that companies know what to do and already start to work with these requirements, although it is not yet fully implemented into these national laws. So then if we start looking at these requirements, can we go to the next slide, please? We see that there is a high requirement, which is basically the cybersecurity risk management measures. And that basically entails that companies need to regularly assess the threat profile. They need to have cybersecurity policies, but they also need to implement technical security measures and need to keep these measures updated. That requires companies to assess their threat profile, but also to consider what works well for them in terms of security. For that to assess, you can look at your own company, but you can also look at market standards and have good discussions with your peers to see what they are considering as part of those standards. In addition to having security measures in place, it is also important to have a robust incident response strategy, which basically means that you have to be cyber resilient for incidents, have crisis incident management frameworks in place so that you can detect and respond to incidents. And not only that, it is also important to train individuals on working with these plans. And a good way to do that could be a tabletop exercise. So going back to the point that I just mentioned about senior management liability and expectations in that regard, it is very important to make sure that if you conduct trainings in relation to incident response, to also make sure that senior management is involved. And if you want to do that effective, my personal recommendation would be to have separate trainings available. So to train the individuals that are part of the core incident response team and separately have a training for senior management. Because senior management will have the opportunity to ask different questions, but also will have to consider different discussions potentially in relation to incident response. All of that is important to consider well before you have an incident, because the better you are prepared, the better the outcome of the incident would be. In relation to internal practices, it is important to also consider what you do throughout the organization with data. Because throughout the life cycle of the data, it is important to apply these measures and to make sure that it is in scope of your NIS2 compliance strategy. For data that flows outside of the organization or comes into the organization, there is also an important consideration in relation to your supply chain, in relation to working with third parties. So NIS2 basically is a spotlight that is put on the data flows in the organization, data flowing into the organization, and data almost leaving the organization. All of that should be assessed for risks, and those risks should be addressed by means of internal governance, but also by means of making sure that you train individuals to properly work with your NIS compliance strategy in relation to the data that they use on a day-to-day basis. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in relation to incident notifications, the requirements that we see in that regard are much stricter than what we are used to working with from a GDPR perspective, for instance. So NIS2 expects the reporting of incidents no later than 24 hours after a cyber incident has happened. There is no need to provide a lot of detailed information at that stage, but you do need to notify the regulator. And then there is an expectation of an ongoing relationship almost with the regulator in relation to that incident by providing updated information. The negative side of the NIS2 directive is that it is implemented in various member states slightly differently. So you will need to assess what you need to do in each of those member states if there is a major incident affecting multiple jurisdictions. We expect that regulators will make sure that they work together very efficiently in this regard, but this is early days of those notification obligations. So a careful assessment on an incident-by-incident basis is what we recommend you to do. And then slightly different from what we see with, for instance, GDPR breach notification obligations is that also here you need to prepare a final report to the relevant authority. Those final reports can sometimes be slightly more detailed than what you are expected to submit to a regulator. And keep in mind that if we talk about NIS2 notification obligations, these are in parallel to other notification obligations. So, for instance, to the expectations of notification obligations that you have under the Cyber Resilience Act, but maybe also notification obligations that you have outside of the Cyber Resilience Act. So going back to the point that I made about the NIS2 requirements in terms of incident response strategy and having an incident response policy, my recommendation would be to reflect your incident response policy from all the notification obligations and incident response obligations that you have as a company. To not only focus on the GDPR and to have something in parallel for NIS2, but to look at it from a higher level and to see what you can really do for the company to bring it in a better position in incident response. And then to consider NIS2, the CRA, the GDPR as part of that, to really consider your legal obligations. But out of those legal obligations, to not only focus on what is required from a regulatory perspective, but to also consider that from what you need to do from a contractual perspective. Because what we see more and more is that also contracting parties demand short breach notification deadlines. It is no longer uncommon that you need to notify insurance companies, but also maybe your main business partners within a certain amount of hours after you become aware of an incident. So also those obligations need to be considered as part of reviewing that incident response plan. And I think this is the time to really start to work on that. And once you've reviewed that incident response plan, take it to the next step to really start to train and make sure that people are well informed and know what to do once they have an incident. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one final slide on NIS2, and that's basically in relation to enforcement, sanctions, and fines. So it is important to consider that the NIS2 sets different expectations in terms of essential entities and important entities. So for essential entities, we see that regulators have more robust measures. They can actually go proactively to these companies and ask them questions about their compliance strategies. Whereas for important entities, it's much more reactive, responsive. So after an incident has occurred, regulators may come in and ask questions. I'm not sure if this is going to make a major difference for companies in practice, but from a legal perspective, we see that there is, well, a slightly different landscape. If there is a reactive outreach from a regulator, there is a possibility for conducting investigations to really assess what went wrong and how that went wrong. The way that regulators will do that is to be determined by national laws, but there is certain standards that are set out in the NIS2 Directive. So in relation to an opportunity to have audits, in relation to an opportunity to obtain information and demand certain activities after an incident. There is also an opportunity to issue public warnings or to have maybe even a temporary suspension of certain authorizations. So the landscape is changing, but all of this, how it will really look like, will also depend on how the companies actually cooperate with these regulators after the first outreach. So our recommendation would be to make sure that there is a decent policy in place and that the people that respond to those regulators really can oversee each step of the investigative process and consider that as part of the initial response strategy already. So then a final word on fines and liability. What we see is that important entities can be imposed fines up to 7 million or 1.4% of the annual turnover, whereas for essential entities that is slightly higher, 10 million versus 2% of the annual turnover. I think more important than looking at the fines is looking at the potential of personal liability. So there is a direct liability potentially for board and directors, which basically leads to an increased personal liability for these individuals. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that knowing what goes on in the company and being involved, but also being in charge becomes more and more important. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, thank you, Joka. So coming from the let's say, sector-specific cybersecurity regulation to a more product-specific view. This is the Cyber Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act, in a nutshell, is a product safety law and fits into the broader framework for product safety laws of the European Union. So if you are already familiar with some product safety requirements, for example, under the Radio Equipment Directive or the Machine Regulation, or even the AI Act, the CRA fits directly into this framework, meaning that, for example, the European Commission's Blue Guide on the interpretation of the product safety framework is applicable also for the Cyber Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act was introduced by the European legislator as a first of its kind legislation in the cybersecurity landscape, because it's actually one of the first laws that very broadly introduces cybersecurity standards for all connected products and software. So having this background, it's really one of the first of its kind law. Something important to remember is that the Cyber Resilience Act just entered into force in December last year, leaving a 3-year transition period in which companies that are subject to the Cyber Resilience Act have time to implement the requirements of the Cyber Resilience Act and make sure that their products meet all the mandatory requirements. As I said, it is a product safety law, meaning that the CE certification that also applies to other requirements is required for products to be eligible for sale on the European market. Products that do not comply with the CRA's requirements may not be sold after 11 December 2027, when the CRA finally becomes fully applicable. There are, as we know from other legal frameworks, also enforcement measures, including fines and administrative orders, which are enforced by the market surveillance authorities in the respective European member states. But let's take a look at the scope of the CRA. As I said, the scope of the CRA is extremely broad. It applies to products with digital elements, which are defined as software and hardware, including their components and remote data processing solutions. This pretty much leads to the result that mostly any type of software and also hardware in the sense of a connected product is in scope of the CRA. And we have many clients who realize that actually a lot of products in the portfolio are subject to the CRA and must comply with the CRA's requirements. The CRA distinguishes between different product categories depending on their risks. There is the biggest category of the default category of products, which can include any type of smart home product, any type of software, for example, photo editing or text processing software, even video games. It can cover hard drives, smart toys, anything of hardware and software products that's not security related. Once we have a security component, we jump into another category of important or critical products. So in the first class of important products, that could be, for example, password managers or operating systems, smart surveillance cameras for your smart home. And in the second category, we also have, for example, microcontrollers. In the critical category, we have, for example, smart meter gateways. So does it really make a difference in which category the product falls into? Yes. With regard to the conformity assessment procedure that must be applied for the product in order to confirm that it meets the CRA standards. But otherwise, this categorization is not so relevant because the general CRA obligations apply to all of the products that are subject to the CRA. But let's look at the CRA in more detail by a typical example. So let's assume we have a company which produces a connected device. For example, a smart home device could be a security camera, which can be controlled via a related app, also developed by the company. And the camera and the app, they communicate with a backend server operated by the company. So we have basically three elements And those are exactly the elements that are covered by the CRA. First, we have the hardware product, which is the smart home camera. Then we have the app, which is a piece of software. And then we have the remote data processing solution with the backend servers. All these three elements are subject to the CRA, meaning that they must comply with the minimum security standards defined in the CRA. So our company now has, well, a whole universe of obligations under the CRA, which can be distinguished between three different phases. The first one is the product development phase. Then we have the placing on the market, so the actual distribution of the product. And then we have the after-sales period, for which the CRA also introduces obligations. Because the goal of the CRA is really to make sure that the entire life cycle of a connected product or a software is subject to minimum standards to really eliminate any cybersecurity risks that can occur during the lifespan of a digital product. So at the product development phase, the most important tasks apply, which is to really make sure that the products that are in scope of the CRA are in line with the CRA's essential cybersecurity requirements. Those are defined in an annex of the CRA and will be later also specified in harmonized standards. A core element to make sure that those requirements are met is the risk assessment that manufacturers must perform, taking into account the entire product lifecycle, any components of third parties that may be involved in the product manufacturing process. All those elements must be assessed in order to identify relevant cybersecurity risks and any mitigation measures to reduce the attack surface and any remaining risks. There's also a requirement for supply chain management, meaning that companies that manufacture products under the CRA will also be obliged to perform a due diligence on their existing vendors with specific CRA focus. And then a very challenging task is also to determine a support period for the product, because the CRA has the requirement that products must be provided with a support period of, as a minimum, 5 years, which is very challenging for many companies. In addition to that, it's necessary to draft information and instructions for users. So this is a known concept under the existing European product safety laws. But for the CRA, we also have this requirement, meaning that if you already have those types of instructions, because the product is subject to radio equipment directive, for example, it will now be a key task to have really instructions for users that inform users about the cybersecurity risks of the intended purpose of use of the product and how to use the product in a safe manner. So that's really something new. Before the product is placed on the market, there's also the, in the end, it's the most important task to perform a conformity assessment. And as I said, for the product categories, here the relevant classification will be key. So if we have a non-critical or default product, there's the option to do a self-assessment, meaning that the manufacturer can itself confirm compliance with the cybersecurity requirements under the CRA. For important or critical products, there's a need to rely on third-party assessments by notified bodies, which is also a known concept. Germany will very likely be the TÜV or other institutions which just perform tests on the final product or a prototype and confirm the conformity with the CRA. So once this task is done, the manufacturer must draw up an EU declaration of conformity in line with the existing concept for declarations of conformity, and affix the CE marking on the product. Also, the technical documentation must be drafted, and this is an internal documentation which must be handed over to market surveillance authorities on request. Another key task is to already think about some reporting channels for vulnerabilities that users may detect during the use of the products. After market release, the exercise is not finalized because manufacturers have an obligation to monitor their products and their use on the market, and specifically notify any exploited vulnerabilities in the product or severe cyber incidents to the NIS2 and local cyber incident response teams of the local market surveillance authorities. So quite a lot of obligations for our company. When it comes to documentation, we have basically three elements, just here on this slide to summarize, that we already know from European product safety laws. First one is the European Declaration of Conformity that must be created. Then we have the information and instructions to users, which is currently like the biggest new aspect, if you are already familiar with EU product safety laws. And then we have the technical documentation. And the latter must be updated regularly. And it's important to know that it's just an internal documentation, meaning it must not be provided to users. It can be voluntarily made public, but it includes a lot of details, including the risk assessment, a software bill of materials, the actual test reports performed by a notified body for the conformity assessment, for example, the criteria on which you have determined the support period. So all crucial information. And then we actually have additional documentation obligations, which is hidden in Article 13, which requires manufacturers to document all cybersecurity aspects relating to a digital product. And this requires to actually document anything that you can have, like documentations from vendors whose components are used in the product, for example, any documentation on vulnerabilities, on prior incidents. So that's important to keep in mind, that we have an additional documentation obligations in addition to these three essential elements. So yeah, let's take just a quick look, also in comparison to what Joke told us about the NIS2 Directive. What happens if a vulnerability or incident for a product is detected? There is a reporting obligation towards the authorities, specifically to ENISA and the local response teams, for actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents, meaning we have a certain threshold, so it's not required to report any vulnerability on the product. And then we have a timeline that's very similar to NIS2, but also to some extent to DORA, starting with an early warning within 24 hours, which is kind of the first warning, and then followed by a detailed report within 72 hours, which is sort of in line with the response time under the GDPR. And then for vulnerabilities, we have a 14-day period. And then for incidents, there's an even longer period of 1 month to submit a final report. There can also be an obligation to inform users But for those notifications, we do not have a specific time frame. It's only required to inform them in a timely manner. That's also in line with the notification obligations towards end users under the NIS2 Directive or even the GDPR. So what's next in terms of CRA compliance? Well, as I said, the CRA will become fully applicable in December 2027. But it's important to keep in mind that actually for products that are on the market already, there is an earlier applicability of the reporting obligations that are just introduced. That's very important to keep in mind, meaning that it's necessary to actually think about the incident reporting as early as possible. Then the biggest question is what is the status of the harmonized standards? Because the CRA establishes a lot of cybersecurity requirements, but those are really creating a lot of question marks among companies on how to apply to a certain category of product. For our smart home camera, for example, there are some requirements that are just not applicable. And this is hopefully well, resolved in the soon future once we have some finalized standards. There is a standardization request pending with the European standardization organizations for 41 standards in total. The timeline, however, is not very comfortable because the first standards are expected to be published well, in the draft version, maybe in the course of this year, but even later, maybe next year, with a timeline reaching into 2027 when the CRA actually 2026 enters into force. So not much time for companies to actually check whether they comply with the standards. So just as a quick wrap up, if you take anything from this presentation, my recommendation is to really, if you haven't checked your product portfolio against the CRA at this point, please do so, because the CRA has a massive and broad scope, and many products and software will be subject to the CRA. So the scoping analysis is something that you can do right away and that we highly recommend to make sure anything is well in line for full compliance once the CRA becomes fully applicable. And then from the product side, we jump to, I think, to the financial sector, please.
Thank you so much, Henrik. So could we move to the next slide, please, Henrik? So the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, it's an EU regulation aimed at enhancing the operational resilience of the financial sector. So it's specific to the financial sector, and it's therefore relevant to regulated financial entities and to suppliers that provide IT services to financial entities. Now, operational resilience refers to the ability of firms and the financial system as a whole to prepare for and to respond to and recover from unplanned events. And this includes things like power outages and cyber attacks. Now, operational resilience has been a priority incident, priority issue for the regulators for some time, for a number of years. So it's not new as a concept, but the risk landscape has evolved due to the increasing digitalization of financial services and the interconnectedness of the financial ecosystem. Now, DORA builds on existing regulations in this area, including the European Banking Authority's guidelines on outsourcing. So DORA regulates the use of ICT services provided by third parties and also regulates internal ICT risks that are faced by financial entities. The definition of ICT services, which you can see here on the screen on the right, It's broad and it includes most types of IT-related services that are provided to regulated firms. That would include cloud services such as SaaS and PaaS, software support and maintenance services, data analytics, data subscriptions, and cybersecurity services as well. DORA became applicable on the 17th of January this year, so it is already fully in force and in effect. Next slide, please. So who does DORA apply to? Well, firstly and primarily, DORA applies to financial entities. These are entities providing regulated financial services within the EU, including banks, payment institutions, e-money institutions, investment firms, insurers, and insurance intermediaries, and a wide list of others, which you can see here in green on the screen. Now, most of the obligations under DORA apply to financial entities. But importantly, DORA also applies to third-party service providers that supply services to the financial sector. Now, for the vast majority of IT suppliers, DORA will apply indirectly. That is to say, there are contractual obligations that suppliers will need to commit to under DORA if they're going to continue to offer services to financial entities. Now, in addition, DORA creates direct obligations to on IT service providers if they're designated as critical ICT third-party service providers. Now, designations haven't yet taken place, but these are expected to be the large IT providers that are considered critical to the stability of the financial ecosystem. Next slide, please. So let's look at the rules themselves. Now, the rules are structured under 5 sections or pillars. So these are, pillar 1 is ICT risk management. Pillar 2 is incident management and reporting. Pillar 3 is testing requirements. Pillar 4 is the management of ICT third-party risk. And pillar 5 is information sharing arrangements. Now, pillars 1 to 4 set out the internal governance controls and risk management arrangements that financial entities are expected to have in place. DORA's 5th pillar is a bit different. It establishes an information sharing framework which will allow financial entities to share information with one another so that they can enhance cybersecurity methods and response capabilities, ultimately helping the sector as a whole to tackle cybercrime. Next slide, please. So let's look a bit closer at these internal governance requirements. Now, under Pillar 1, financial entities are expected to implement an ICT risk management framework. The framework should be documented and it should be reviewed at least once a year, and it's going to be subject to internal audit. The ICT risk management framework should, among other things, cover measures to ensure protection of ICT systems, monitoring and testing, and ICT business continuity plans. Pillar 2, the next one on the table. Pillar 2 sets out the requirements for managing ICT incidents. There is a new harmonized reporting regime which requires major ICT related incidents to be reported to regulators, and also an option for financial entities to voluntarily report cyber threats. Similarly to the CRA, we see that DORA requires an initial notification within 4 hours from classification and within 24 hours from detection. And then there's an intermediate report which will be expected within 72 hours, and then a final report within 1 month. Next, we have Pillar 3. Now, this is about testing. Financial entities are required to have a testing program, which may include vulnerability assessments and scans, open source analysis, network and physical security assessments, gap analysis, scanning software solutions, source code reviews, end-to-end testing, and penetration testing. Now, some financial entities will also be expected to conduct threat-led penetration testing at least once every 3 years. There's a special framework around this, and the testing must be conducted on live production systems. And finally, Pillar 4 sets out the requirements in relation to ICT third-party risk. Financial entities are expected to specifically address third-party risk within their risk management framework, and this includes maintaining a register of information relating to third-party ICT services and reporting to authorities at least annually, providing information about the third-party arrangements that they have in place. There's also requirements, importantly, to conduct due diligence on service providers in the supply chain and to put in place written agreements that contain certain mandatory provisions. Next slide, please. So for IT providers, so as opposed to the financial entities, the most relevant DORA requirements are likely to be the contractual requirements that are set out in Article 30 of DORA. Now, DORA requires financial entities to put in place written agreements with their IT suppliers, and those agreements must contain a number of mandatory terms which are aimed at ensuring the quality, reliability, and the continuity of ICT services that are relied upon by the financial entity. Now, additional and more onerous obligations will apply to service providers that supply services supporting critical or important functions of a financial entity. It's ultimately up to the financial entity to identify which of its functions are critical or important and to map the services that support them. In practice, and some of the obligations that are required are set out on the screen. Now, negotiating these contracts can be very challenging for both financial entities and for their service providers. And this is the area where, in practice, many financial entities are not yet fully compliant with DORA, and it remains a work in progress. Next slide, please. Now let's touch briefly on the oversight framework for critical ICT third-party service providers. There's still much anticipation and speculation as to which service providers are going to be designated. And whilst there are formal designation criteria that give an indication as to the types of service providers that will be caught, we still don't know exactly who will be designated and how many providers will be on that list. However, the European supervisory authorities have published a designation roadmap that explains the process for designation. And this has provided us with some clarity on the process and the timeframe. Now, based on this roadmap, we can expect designations to be finalised ultimately by the end of this, but later in this year. And note that there will be a 6-week objection period. So, the providers will be notified if they are going to be designated, and from there'll be a 6-week period of objection, so that providers can object to designation if they think they should not have been designated. Once a provider has been designated, then a lead overseer will be appointed. That's one of the ESAs to oversee their activities. And the lead overseer will have the power to investigate, to inspect, and issue recommendations and even penalties directly to the critical ICT third-party service providers. Next slide, please. So, there are some clear similarities between particularly DORA and NIS2, and in some circumstances they may overlap, which will foreseeably create some confusion and uncertainty. Now, ultimately, the applicability of each framework will need to be assessed by businesses that are in scope, but there are important differences. The most obvious difference is in relation to scope. So DORA is a financial services regulation. It only applies to the financial services sector, whereas NIS2 applies across 18 different sectors, including energy, transport, health, digital infrastructure, waste management, chemicals, food, and manufacturing. Where there are overlaps, for example, in relation to financial market infrastructures, DORA will take precedent to the extent of any conflict, but it's not. That's not a simplistic. That's not a simplistic rule, because it depends upon the specific obligations that sit under each of the frameworks. It's also notable that DORA is a regulation and is therefore directly applicable, whereas NIS2, as Yoke explained, is a directive. There is an implementing regulation as well, but ultimately it will be implemented and transposed into the national laws of individual member states. So next slide, please. With that, we are going to move on to some questions. We have some questions from the chat, so let me turn to those now. So the first question we have is, the CRA, does it apply to products put on the market before December 2027? So for example, selling after December 2027 of a product put on the market before that date, would it require a conformity assessment? So I think if I can pass that to Henrik to answer, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's a highly relevant question. There are a few considerations. The most important one is that the CRA, as other product safety law, apply to the individual product. So when we are looking at our example of the smart home camera, for example, it depends when the individual device is made available or put on the EU market. So the CRA does not cover to us the product series or a certain product type or product line, but to the individual device. Meaning cameras, in our example, that are sold after 11 December 2027 and placed on the market in the EU, they must be fully compliant with the CRA. Products placed on the market before that date do not need to comply, with two exceptions. One, the vulnerability and incident notification obligations apply already from September 2026, meaning they apply also to products already on the market. Second exemption is a substantial modification. This is also a known concept under European safety laws. If a product is modified in a substantial manner, the CRA will apply to the product, although it was made available on the market prior to December 2027. The substantial modification concept really causes some headache when it comes to software, but also other digital products in the hardware sector. This is why the European Commission is requested to produce guidance on the concept of substantial modification, specifically under the CRA. So I know that many companies are waiting for that guidance.
Thank you. The next question is, are there obligations for the wholesale level to verify the manufacturer has complied with its obligations? And similarly, will the importer have manufacturer's obligations if importing from non-EU countries? Henrik, again, I think that one's for you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a very good point, because I skipped that. We have different types of economic operators. So there's the manufacturer for which the most and the strictest obligations apply, obviously. But then we also have the importer and the distributor, which are also concepts under EU law. And the importer specifically has an obligation to ensure before the product is imported, to ensure that the manufacturer has complied with its core obligations. So meaning, is there a conformity assessment procedure completed for the product? Is the technical documentation that I just described, is that in place? Is the CE marking on the product? And are other core obligations under the CRA complied with? So that's an obligation of the importer. It's possible that some companies are also in different roles at the same time. So it's possible to be a manufacturer and importer at the same time. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and this is why we recommend really to put some work into the scoping and applicability assessment when checking whether a product is subject to the CRA and which role of an economic operator a company has under the CRA, just to determine the applicable obligations.
Thanks, Henrik. The next question is in the context of a B2B sale of a custom-made product to a customer, which is integrated as a component in the product. Can our customer contractually release us from the obligations of the CRA if both sides agree?
Yeah, that's a very common question that we get a lot, and the general rule is and response is no, because this would conflict with the goal of the CRA to really make sure that any cybersecurity threats resulting from the use of software and hardware are eliminated. So if a product is custom made, it still fulfills the definition of a digital or product with digital elements. It will be subject to the CRA, and there's generally no option just to contractually agree that the CRA applications will not be applicable, because it's really focusing on the product and its characteristics.
Thanks, Henrik. The next question is for Joke. Do entities without establishment in the EU member states fall within the scope of the NIS2 Directive if they provide NIS2 relevant services in EU member states but don't belong to the entities listed in Article 26(1)(b)?
Yes, happy to take that one. So the NIS2 Directive has the extraterritoriality principle, similar to what we know from a GDPR perspective. And that basically means that if you are not based in the EU, so a non-EU entity, but you provide those NIS2 related services within the EU, you might be subject to the directive. So the directive provides that some specific examples are excluded, so under Article 26(1)(b), but there are also some other exemptions. So if an entity doesn't belong to the categories listed in that article or in the other exemptions and does not meet the criteria for essential or important entities, I would generally consider that not to fall in scope of NIS2. But I think what is most important here is to really start that assessment on making a determination for yourself whether you qualify as essential or important before you start to consider whether or not you are maybe exempted from scoping.
Great, thank you. The next question is a DORA question. Where it's clear that a software contract, say, between a German financial entity providing ICT services to a German customer under German law would need to include Article 30 requirements under DORA. To what extent should it be assumed that say the UK arm of that same provider business would be required to include those contractual terms we're providing to a German customer, yet under UK law post-Brexit. So I think the general rule is that irrespective of where the service provider is located, so the service provider may be located within the EU or the UK or the United States or anywhere in the world, but if they are providing services to a regulated financial entity within the EU, then they will be expected to have in place the relevant Article 30 requirements. Now, the question mentions that it's a German financial entity providing ICT services to a customer. Now, if there is an exemption under DORA in relation to ICT services where the provider, where the relevant services are themselves financial services, that's the financial services exemption. So this may well be a case where if the provider itself is a regulated financial entity, then it may be subject to that exemption. But otherwise, the general rule is that ICT services, regardless of where they are provided from in the world, will need to meet the Article 30 requirements if they're provided to EU regulated entities. And we are just out of time, but I think we have just one more question. To what extent should internal data center services for other group companies be taken into account when reviewing the applicability of the NIS2 Directive?
Yeah, shall I just give a very brief answer to the question? And sorry, there is I think a need for ultimately assessing this in a bit more detail, but I think the general answer to the question would be that if the internal data center operations itself are considered essential or important services for the group companies that themselves fall under NIS2, you can expect that those data centers are likely also going to be subject to NIS2. So that would mean that those data centers would be in scope of NIS2 and having those obligations in terms of risk management and incident response notifications.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, I think we should close this webinar. And I'd like to, on behalf of VOK, Henrik, and myself, I'd like to say a big thanks for joining us. Do get in touch with us after the webinar if you have any other questions. Thank you.